All right, it's time to get more controversial and dive into some taboo subjects. In this chapter, we're going to take a deeper dive into an American crisis, a crisis that might be labeled the decay of the American woman. These women are educated, empathetic, passionate, and vocal. Unfortunately, they're also delusional, ignorant, and dangerous. From an evolutionary biology perspective, women haven't changed much in the last 10,000 years. Culturally, however, there have been some great changes, which in turn may have led to some massive changes in women, morally, intellectually, and psychologically. I believe it is because of the system, our American system, is corrupting and poisoning women, and it is creating a ripple effect that is hurting all of us. I will assert that it is this corruption that is the primary source and root cause for our societal moral divisiveness. I will also assert that there are two primary driving factors that are causing this, and in this chapter, we're going to focus on one of them. And I think it's incumbent upon every intelligent and moral American adult to help course correct the system that is crushing our American women. I believe that women, more so than men, are particularly susceptible to the corruption in our system. So in this chapter, we're going to begin to introduce the concept of intelligence between the sexes, the ramifications of higher learning, and the unintended consequences and the blowback we all suffer as a result. So with that, let's get started. First off, it's important to note that I'm not suggesting that all women are equal in temperament, personality, or intelligence. I say this because I get frustrated when talking to people who struggle with statistical generalizations, and I will posit this is far more applicable to women than men. I think one of the reasons women get uncomfortable discussing sex differences is because they confuse averages with absolutes. That's not how statistics work. It's not how biology works. It's not how psychology works. And frankly, that's not how reality works. We need to establish a simple rule of reality. When scientists talk about group differences, they're talking about bell curves, averages, and probabilities, not absolutes. There will always be exceptions. The existence of exceptions, however, does not invalidate the average. For example, imagine taking every man and every woman on Earth and measuring one particular trait, say empathy, risk aversion, quantitative reasoning, or an interest in engineering versus nursing. You'd get two giant bell-shaped curves. Those curves overlap a lot. There are women who are more analytical than most men. There are men who are more empathetic than most women. There are women who love engineering and men who want to become elementary school teachers. But the key is that the averages matter. If I told you that men are taller than women, every sane person understands what that means. No one thinks I'm claiming that every man is taller than every woman. We understand intuitively that we are talking about averages and probabilities. Psychologists measure these average differences using something called an effect size. That's just a fancy academic term for asking one simple question. How far apart are the male and female bell curves? If the difference is tiny, you barely notice it in everyday life. If the difference is large, it helps explain why entire professions, hobbies, and life choices end up being dominated by one sex or another. Having said that, our modern woke and feminist culture would have us believe that every disparity is proof of discrimination and that unequal outcomes automatically imply injustice. It doesn't. That perspective is emotionally driven, irrational nonsense. Whenever groups differ on average in intelligence, interest, abilities, personality traits, preferences, or risk tolerance, we should expect unequal representation across occupations and activities. Lack of equal representation is not evidence of injustice. It is a result of inequality of traits, personalities, intelligence, and sex differences among men and women. To deny this is to deny reality. Women need to understand this. The ones that don't will accuse men of being sexist, misogynistic, and toxic. They will blame it on our patriarchal system. And if you read between the lines, it appears these women believe men should be aligned with their values and their perspectives. Let's get something straight. Men are not broken versions of women. We don't think like women, we don't act like women, we don't want to be like women. Our motivations, drives, and priorities are fundamentally different. That's not sexism, it's biology, genetics, and science. Personally, I'm getting tired of these women who think men need to cry more, to talk about their feelings like women do, and to put the work in with a therapist, ignoring that stoic and emotional control are male survival traits embedded in our genetics, our DNA, and our human nature. But let's look at what science actually says. One of the strongest findings in psychology is that women score higher in agreeableness. Agreeableness includes traits like compassion, warmth, altruism, cooperation, and concern for others. The difference isn't tiny. What does this mean in plain English? It means that if you randomly selected an average woman, she would score higher in agreeableness than about 2/3 of men. Again, that doesn't mean that all women are agreeable or that all men are disagreeable. It means that the female bell curve is shifted enough so that women, on the average, tend to prioritize cooperation, social harmony, and caring for others more than men do. Evolutionarily, This shouldn't surprise us. Human infants are incredibly vulnerable. Throughout most of human history, survival depended heavily on caregiving, social bonding, and maintaining relationships. Now let's talk about one of the biggest psychological differences ever measured between men and women. Women score substantially higher on what psychologists call harm avoidance. This includes anxiety, worry, fear sensitivity, emotional vulnerability, and risk aversion. And before anyone gets offended, remember, evolution and natural selection doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about survival. And after tens of thousands of years, evolutionarily, the average woman scores higher than roughly 70% of men on measures related to caution and harm avoidance. In many situations, being more cautious is adaptive. It's why women are less likely to die in motorcycle accidents and less likely to take reckless physical risks. But it also means women on the average may be more sensitive to perceived threats, whether those threats are physical, emotional, social, or even real threats. Now, let's move on to one of the most replicated findings in all psychology: empathy. We touched on the value of empathy in previous chapters, but as a reminder, women score higher than men on emotional empathy, empathetic concern, social attunement, and emotional responsiveness. Again, the difference isn't subtle. The average woman scores higher than approximately 70 to 80% of men on many of the measures of emotional empathy. Think about what that means. If a child is crying, a friend is upset, or someone is suffering, women are, on average, more likely to notice it, more likely to feel it, and more likely to respond emotionally. This trait is enormously valuable. Civilizations require compassion. Families require compassion. Human beings require compassion. But every strength can become a weakness if it's disconnected from reality. Empathy without intelligence, without reason, and critical thinking can produce poor decisions just as easily as intelligence without empathy can produce cruel ones. Which brings us to the controversial subject of this chapter. How is it that our American women and youth are becoming dumber, more delusional, and more dangerous? After all, it's not like women have changed evolutionary in the last 100 years. Well, to answer that question, we need to understand why it is the case that women, the more educated they are, the more likely they are to vote Socialist Democrat. I suspect most of us already know the recent statistics being blasted on CNN and MSNBC that clearly stated that those with college degrees lean liberal and those without lean Republican. This seems to imply that smarter people lean Democrat. And that's the message I think they want you to walk away with, right? Because statistics clearly show that the most educated people tend to vote liberal.
Let's start with white college grads, because white college grads have been this group that have been moving further and further to the left. All right, this is the Democratic margin among white college grads. Look, Hillary Clinton won him by 5 points. Then Joe Biden won him by 9. Look at this margin that Kamala Harris is pulling up in the polls right now among white college grads. It's an 18-point margin, double the margin that Joe Biden had just 4 years ago. How about all voters with a college degree? It's basically the same story. It's historically high support for a Democratic candidate. You see right now Kamala Harris leads in the polls by 21 points. That's 3 points higher than Joe Biden did 4 years ago. At 6 points higher than Hillary Clinton did 8 years ago. The bottom line is this, Mr. Berman. The electorate is becoming more polarized along education, and Democrats, at least among those with a college degree, are the beneficiaries of it, and Kamala Harris is doing historically well for a Democrat among voters with a college degree.
Liberals tend to flaunt this statistic like a badge of honor because it implies that liberals are more educated and therefore smarter than conservatives, and therefore intellectually superior and morally in the right. So, from their perspective, if you don't vote for their favorite woke progressive agenda, it's because you're ignorant or naive. This perspective, I believe, gives them unwarranted confidence in their opinion. And to be fair, you can understand how liberals might feel validated in this perspective, because after all, if educated people are seen as smarter, and smarter people tend to vote liberal, then it stands to reason they would believe that dumber people vote Republican. And when I say dumber, I'm being generous. The reality on social media is that Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, and independents are portrayed as ignorant racists, rednecks, or hillbillies. You know it, and I know it.
And 45% believe Democrats should be more moderate. What do you take away? I think there's a lot to make of those numbers. What's your takeaway from that?
My takeaway is just like the election. We've got to do better at education. People don't understand.
It's very clear. It's not only clear by race, but it's also clear by education. And so the notion somehow that that is not true, this is by education. Those who attended college voted for her at a higher degree than those that didn't.
But I think I've said that.
Let me just finish. And so I've said that before, and there was so much backlash because I think it's an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth about this country. But his whole point.
Most people voted the wrong way because they were uneducated, and that's not to call them dumb, but literally life sometimes is life. And so you're not tuned in to the endless news cycle, or you don't know what the truth is. And that means showing up and being educated, not being played. I don't care what no celebrity nothing says.
Ah, words of wisdom. Here's the reality check, Sonny. For you, this chapter will be an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth. I'm not suggesting that these voting by education statistics are wrong, but I do believe they're misleading, because when it comes to deriving which voter is smarter, the devil is in the details. So, let's get ready to geek out and take a slightly deeper dive and expose the wizards behind the curtain. And to do this, we're going to separate intelligence from education. First, let's tackle the notion of intelligence. Intelligence today is primarily measured using IQ tests. IQ tests aim to measure a person's ability to learn, reason, solve problems, and handle new information. They're not perfect, no test is, but they're still the best single predictor we have for a lot of real-world stuff. IQ is one of the strongest predictors of academic success, such as grades, test scores, and finishing college. It's also a top predictor for doing well in complex jobs, especially professional, managerial, and STEM roles. And it correlates pretty solidly with long-term earning potential. That's not my opinion. That's what decades of data have to show. It's also important to understand that IQ isn't one magic number pulled out of thin air. It's an aggregate. It's built from different cognitive abilities that modern intelligence research organizes under the Cattle-Horn-Carroll theory, CHC theory for short, which is the most widely accepted framework right now. At the top is G for general intelligence, but below that are broad subset abilities, often called G factors. These are the major domains that IQ tests like the WAIS 5 try to measure through their index scores. WAIS 5 stands for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the 5th edition, or Wechsler, or however you pronounce that in German. And though men and women score approximately the same at the aggregate level, at the subset level, men and women score differently in each one of these G factors. And the top 10 G factors, I'm just going to rattle them off, are fluid reasoning, crystallized intelligence, visual processing and spatial ability, working memory and short-term memory, processing speed, long-term storage and retrieval, quantitative knowledge and reasoning, auditory processing, reaction and decision speed, and reading and writing. Okay, now let's just focus on the top 5 ones where we find the greatest differences between men and women, ranked in the order of highest difference to lowest difference. Coming in at first place is GV, which is the visual spatial processing. This is your brain's ability to perceive, analyze, and mentally manipulate visual patterns and spatial relationships. Think mentally rotating a 3D object, navigating without a map, judging distances, or figuring out how parts fit together in your head. It's the key ability for physics, engineering, architecture, and mechanical work. And what sex do you think dominates here? Men. And it's not even close in my opinion. It's a shellacking. However, scientists would simply phrase it such that, in this domain, men show the largest and most consistent average advantage, especially on mental rotation tasks. Effect sizes often land in the moderate to large range, roughly 4 to 9 IQ points on broad measures, but up much higher, up to 10 to 13 on pure mental rotation tasks. This is the largest cognitive sex difference documented across all cultures and age groups. And it is yet another reason why I find the notion of raising a child as gender neutral to be absurd. Evolutionarily, the leading hypothesis ties this to ancestral male roles in hunting, tracking prey across landscapes, navigating, and crafting tools, skills that rewarded strong spatial mapping and mental manipulation in variable environments. This ability shows up in everything from fighter pilots and surgeons who mentally rotate organs or instruments, to engineers designing complex systems, to chess grandmasters visualizing boards many moves ahead, to people who are just naturally good at packing a car for a road trip. It's also the reason men are generally far more skilled in other common day areas such as navigating and orienteering. We use spatial recognition, north, south. Women tend to use landmarks. It's also the reason men are generally better at parking and reversing a vehicle, especially in tight spaces or crowded parking lots. Men are also better at video games, first-person shooter games. We're better at strategy games. Men are also better at throwing objects and mentally calculating the trajectory, be it a rock, a spear, or football. We're better at solving mechanical and spatial puzzles like jigsaw puzzles or playing Tetris. The visual spatial processing also allows us to dominate in areas of operating construction equipment, playing billiards, flying drones, or RC aircrafts. We're better at assembling things, mechanical kits, models, and building furniture. We find it easier because we have an easier time visualizing how all the parts fit together, thereby also reducing the assembly time and errors. So ladies, take solace in this reality. It's not that you're dumb because you can't put IKEA furniture together. It's that generally, by a large amount, women on the average are completely inferior to men when it comes to visual spatial processing intelligence. You might say you're not as privileged as men are in these areas. These observations are not a product of misogyny or sexism. It's science, it's biology, genetics, human nature. And again, to believe otherwise is to deny reality. Now, coming in at second place is GS, processing speed. This is how quickly and accurately your brain handles simple cognitive tasks under time pressure, scanning information, making quick decisions, and executing routine mental operations efficiently. Women show a small to moderate advantage here, roughly 4 to 7 IQ points on the average. It's one of the more reliable female edges in cognitive testing. Evolutionarily, hypotheses often link it to ancestral female roles involved in gathering, rapid visual foraging, and multitasking while monitoring infants or social cues in group settings. It's the cognitive version of being quick on your feet in everyday complexity. This shows up in real life as advantages in tasks requiring rapid visual scanning and clerical type speed. Think of certain administrative roles, quality control, or even some aspects of nursing and teaching while you're juggling multiple quick inputs. Okay, coming in at number 3, we have GQ, which is quantitative knowledge and reasoning. This covers number sense, mathematical knowledge, and the ability to reason with quantity and logical structures. Not just memorizing formulas, but understanding relationships and solving problems with numbers and logic. Men tend to show a moderate advantage here as well, especially on more complex or novel quantitative reasoning tasks, which roughly translate into about 3 to 7 IQ points. And the gap widens at extreme high ends of the distribution, which helps explain why men do better in fields like physics, engineering, finance, and certain data-heavy domains. Evolutionarily, it connects to male tool-making, resource allocation, hunting calculations, and later innovations in measurement and construction. This isn't just guys are better at math class. It shows up in pattern recognition in complex systems, financial modeling, scientific research involving data, and strategic decision-making. Combined with spatial skills, it creates a powerful combo for many technical fields. Number 4, GF, which is fluid reasoning. This is your ability to solve brand new problems, see abstract patterns, and reason logically without leaning on stored knowledge. It is the think on your feet factor, adapting to novel situations. Here too, men show an advantage, roughly 3 to 6 IQ points on the average. Evolutionarily, it aligns with demands for flexible problem solving in hunting, warfare, exploration, and building in changing conditions, environments that rewarded coming up with novel solutions on the fly. This is the cognitive engine behind innovation, scientific discovery, strategic problem solving in uncertain environments. It is the key for science, engineering, and abstract strategy. And lastly, we have number 5, crystallized intelligence and reading-writing skills. This is your accumulated knowledge bank, vocabulary, facts, cultural understanding, verbal reasoning, plus reading comprehension and writing fluency. It's what you've learned and can use effectively. When it comes to this crystallized intelligence among men and women, the differences are small, often near zero, but with a slight female tilt in verbal fluency, reading, and writing aspects of about less than 3 IQ points. Evolutionarily, hypotheses often point to female roles in social bonding, storytelling, teaching the young, and transmitting group knowledge, skills that rewarded verbal fluency and social intelligence in ancestral communities. In modern-day context, this powers teaching, literature, law, medicine on the knowledge side, counseling, in any field where accumulated expertise and clear communication matter. Now, for the remainder of the G factors I listed earlier, I'm not going to cover them as they produce negligible differences between the sexes. So look, these average differences exist. Men as a group tend to show strengths in certain spatial fluid reasoning areas, women as a group in processing speed and some verbal fluency tasks. Both patterns make sense from evolutionary, biological, and cultural angles, and both are valuable in different contexts. The data doesn't require conspiracy theories or value judgments. It just is what it is. Variation in human cognition that helps explain why people gravitate toward or succeed in different fields. We shouldn't pretend these differences don't exist, nor do we need to turn them into some kind of battle of the sexes. We need to accept the objective reality. It's science, it's biology, it's genetics, it's human nature, and it matters. When we deny reality, ignore reality, and censor reality, we do a great disservice to our society and our women. And guess which sex is more likely to justify censorship of reality if it's perceived as harmful, offensive, or psychologically damaging? You guessed it, women. But I would posit that this sensitivity censorship trend toward political correctness is dishonest and dangerous, and it's leaving our citizens, especially women, delusional and depressed. The more we censor reality, the more we start to accumulate lies upon lies until we get to the point where people are completely outraged because they think there's a systematic injustice. Case in point, Harvard. Harvard University used to be a beacon of intellectuals. Now they are a woke joke collection of clowns. Personally, I've gotten to the point where if I see a Harvard resume come across my desk, there's a damn good chance it's going right in the trash. Harvard's been going down the toilet for a while, but I think it probably peaked in 2005 when Larry Summers, the president of Harvard University, spoke at a closed-door academic conference at the National Bureau of Economic Research on diversifying the science and engineering workforce. He proposed 3 possible explanations for the underrepresentation of women in the elite STEM roles. 1 was a work-life balance, child-rearing preferences. 2 was socialization and discrimination. And the 3rd was an innate cognitive difference in ability and variability between the sexes. Unsurprisingly, it was this last point, the possibility of innate differences in cognitive ability or variability, that sparked the outrage, particularly with one Nancy Hopkins, an MIT biology professor who walked out of the talk, later telling the press, quote, "I felt like I was going to be sick. My heart was pounding and my breath was shallow." She explained that had she stayed in the room, she would have either thrown up or blacked out. I mean, come on. Well, it didn't take long before her emotional response became symbolic of a broader cultural movement, where expression of certain scientific hypotheses were no longer considered just controversial, but offensive. Hopkins gave the Summers incident an emotional anchor. Her dramatic response made it feel less like a scientific misstep and more like an ethical violation. The liberal media headlines focused on her nausea, not on Summers' actual words or the data references. In doing so, she was justifying censorship, suggesting that even the discussion of biological sex differences was now beyond the pale in the elite academic spaces. So again, this is just my opinion, but I think this was probably the inflection point where Harvard just threw in the towel and went full-blown woke and useless when they bent over to Nancy Hopkins and her progressive feminist activism. And this was the moment that fired a warning shot across the bow of all academia, letting them know that you are no longer allowed to question everything, and that now there are certain questions that must not be asked, regardless of what the truth is. And as we've briefly discussed and will continue to discuss in the future, this censorship of reality has extreme negative consequences, not just for government policy, but for the hate, violence, tension, mental health, and happiness of our society. And when we deal with the IQ variances among different groups, we're dealing with an area that has definitely sparked emotional reaction and outrage. Anyway, back to the IQ and the implications. Let's take the strategy game of chess. It's a classic that has stood the test of time. Using artificial intelligence to estimate the cognitive breakdown of the mastered level chess skills, we find that working memory and long-term memory combined constitute about 45% of the skills needed to master chess. 18% visual spatial processing, about 15% fluid reasoning, and about 10% processing speed. Okay, using that breakout, you would expect women to be much better at chess than they really are. But if we look at working memory, we'll see it comes in different flavors. Women score higher in verbal working memory, which aligns to language, short-term recall, verbal tasks, while men, on the other hand, do much better with the visual spatial working memory, remembering the board positions and rotating pieces mentally. So the kind of working memory that is needed to win in chess includes being able to track spatial layouts of the pieces, hold if-then trees of tactical sequences. For example, if I take and he checks, then I block, then he forks, and so forth. It involves backtracking and revisualizing previous states. So even though women outperform men in some memory types, chess draws heavily on the male-favored memory systems. Then throw in the spatial processing advantage that men have, for visualizing moves ahead, rotating the board mentally, blindfold play, and tactical awareness, and it becomes a slaughter. And knowing what we know, what we've covered so far, it shouldn't surprise us that there's an underrepresentation of women in chess. It's not injustice. Only 13% of registered chess players in the U.S. are women. Globally, as of October 2023, only 2.3% of chess grandmasters are women. That's it. This is not because of cultural conditioning. It's because women generally don't excel at visual spatial intelligence. And let's be clear, there's no physical component to chess, right? It's all mental. Yet, in over 125 years of world chess champions, not a single woman has ever won this title. The best a woman has ever done, just one woman in 125 years, was reaching the equivalent of the lowest seed in the Elite Eight. Now, again, does this mean that all men are universally smarter than all women? No. Like before, that's not how it works. Bell curve. But it does mean that there are substantial measurable differences in how men and women think and process information. And if that offends you, well, statistically, you're probably a woman or a liberal. I will leave you with this little fun fact to close on intelligence. If we take the standard IQ test results we've done for decades, you'll notice that the bell curve IQ was normally distributed with a mean of 100. You'll notice that men and women both have the same mean IQ, but men have a greater variance. What does this mean? Well, when we look at IQs above 130, about 2 standard deviations above the mean, which represents about the top 2% of the population, men outnumber women 2 to 1. 2 to 1. And the gap winds even more when we're dealing with IQs of 145 plus to 160. Now we're talking way gifted genius levels where men outnumber women 4 to 1 or 8 to 1 depending on the study. Now, to be fair, Just as there are far more men that are more intelligent than women on the high side, there are equally more men that are dumber than women on the low end. We'll discuss this further in the chapter when we take a deeper dive in the American male. But anyway, those are the facts. I hope you can handle the facts, because if you can't handle the facts without freaking out, maybe the problem isn't the data, it's your unwillingness to face it. All right, I think we've covered enough on the intelligence front. Men and women are different biologically, genetically, as a product of natural selection. Now, let's move on to cultural selection, driven by our system, and in this case, education. And like I've said before, Democrats love to remind everybody that 62% of the people with postgraduate degrees supported the Democratic candidate.
Did you know Democrats are the most college-educated political party and have the most degrees? Yeah, I guess that's why normal people can't understand us, but it's the price of intellect, I guess.
Oh, that's what I was smelling.
Yeah, maybe we lose because we're too smart. Like people can't understand us.
So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, does having a degree really mean you're smarter? Or are we just talking about more indoctrination at higher levels of education? To answer these questions honestly, we have to go beyond the political sound bites and break this down by degree type, because this is where we're going to find the truth. We're not going to be lumping everybody into one big, massive, progressive blob. Instead, we're going to break down these postgraduates and actually look at what kind of degrees these postgraduates are actually getting. And we're going to start by breaking them into two big bins. We're going to be looking at STEM versus non-STEM. And when I say STEM, I'm referring to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. STEM. These are the degrees that actually require brain power, high IQ, critical thinking, and not just the ability to regurgitate talking points. Of the postgraduate degree holders cited in the liberal polls, only 17% of the master's degrees were in actual STEM fields. The other 83 of the postgraduate degrees, they were in fields that don't require complex reasoning or problem solving, what we might call soft degrees, such as education, social sciences, and liberal arts. Take a look at this IQ chart. It's broken into the most popular STEM and non-STEM master's degrees. Now, you'll notice, because liberal arts degrees come in so many flavors, the top 10 most popular non-STEM degrees only equate to about 80% of all liberal arts students. Look at the STEM degree average IQs versus the non-STEM degree average IQs for these postgraduates. The difference is huge. You can't fake your way through electrical engineering or advanced calculus, and this IQ chart proves it. Degrees like engineering and physics require much higher level of intelligence than fields like education and public administration. Generally, the lowest IQ college students overwhelmingly fall into liberal arts. Now, keep in mind, these ranges are still averages, mean scores for postgraduate degrees. Now, let's look at the breakout for undergrad degrees. You'll notice the IQ drops even further. The averages range on the lower end from well below average IQ to just average IQ. Now, these averages are tied to a bell curve, which means there are students well above and well below these averages. These are not great scores. To put it in context, did you know that the military, who would like to take all qualified people, is legally, federally restricted from recruiting people who have a low IQ? The legal floor is about 83 IQ. The reason they did this was because they found that low IQ people caused higher training failure rates, significantly higher casualty and death rates in combat. They had greater difficulty adapting to complex modern equipment and tactics, and created long-term issues for many veterans. The hard floor of 83 was codified after Vietnam, when Congress and the DoD institutionalized the lesson that extreme low cognitive ability, below the 10th percentile, creates unacceptable risks for trainability, because modern military jobs require learning technical skills, following procedures, operating complex systems, and making decisions under stress. It created unacceptable risks for unit effectiveness and safety, high error rates, accidents. It created unacceptable cost efficiencies, high washout rates, wasting training resources. And it created fairness and ethic issues. They realized it was unfair to send the cognitively vulnerable into high-risk roles. Now, that's the absolute legal floor. In reality, the armed forces set the bar much higher to avoid those issues. Armed forces qualifications test IQ equivalency floor for enlisted recruits. These are the people without college degrees right out of high school. Are Army, IQ 93. Marine Corps, IQ 93. Navy, IQ 94. Air Force and Space Force, IQ of 94. And the Coast Guard, an IQ of 95. That's the IQ floor for the armed forces just to get in. So what does this mean? Approximately 37 to 40% of college students in those non-STEM majors with a group averages of 94 to 98 IQ would fall below the U.S. military's typical enlisted entry thresholds, which is about an IQ of 93, which is the lowest in the armed forces. So close to half these non-STEM or liberal students aren't even qualified to be a soldier. And the reality gets uglier when trying to become an officer in the U.S. Armed Forces. For these candidates, the minimum IQ to get in is about 108 to 112. This means that the majority of the non-STEM liberal arts students wouldn't even qualify to enter officer schooling. And of the Service Academy graduates, which trend higher due to the academic filtering, their IQ averages range from 115 to 125 plus. So, if we're looking into the average IQ comparison between postgraduate masters in non-STEM liberal arts degrees with an IQ average distribution around 108, and we compare them with the lower end of the Service Academy graduates, about 68% would fail the test. Even on the higher end of the IQ average range for liberal arts, it's still more than 50% failing to meet this bar. And it gets even uglier when we look at special operations officers, elite units, and specialized training where they require even higher cognitive abilities, plus leadership thresholds. Now check out this chart. This is the cognitive fingerprint overlay of different majors. Using G-factor analysis, we match the most common non-STEM degrees with the different types of intelligence they require. What should jump out at you is that these fields lean heavily toward G-factors where women generally outperform men. Things like memorization, vocabulary, and verbal recall. Again, it's biology. The pink zones on the chart, those are the female advantage traits. Blue zones, male advantage. And the darker the color, the more dominant the sex and that G-factor. Look closely where women dominate. These are the degrees or subjects that require listening, grammar, writing, vocabulary skills, memorizing, having short-term working memory, long-term storage and retrieval. And women are generally better at these things than men. And you'll notice that business is a little bit of a gray area. We'll take a deeper dive into this in the whole next series when we deal with economics, because there are different types of business degrees, and the nature of the degrees matters as far as the intelligence required to succeed in it. Okay, now let's switch gears to STEM degrees. The subjects that are more complex that require systems thinking, calculation, and strategy, and the most difficult problem solving are the subjects where men have a clear and distinct advantage. Look at the deep blue. That's male advantage in areas like visual spatial processing and quantitative reasoning. These aren't optional skills in STEM degrees. They're foundational. With the exception of biology, men have a clear advantage in every primary G factor across these fields. It's built in. It's in our nature. However, strictly based on media coverage I've seen, a lot of liberal journalists claim it is environmental pressure that drives people of different sexes into different fields, reminiscent of the gender-neutral arguments. They argue that just because someone has a genetic edge doesn't mean they'll pursue that field. Okay, let's look at what students actually do when they have a choice. And boom, it almost lines up perfectly. Men gravitate toward complex systems, strategy, and problem solving. Women dominate in fields centered on memorization, empathy, and emotional reasoning. Even after decades of feminist pressure, DEI incentives, and the "you can do anything you want" slogans, they still go where they're naturally inclined. Dr. Jordan Peterson cleverly once said, "Men tend to like things, women tend to like people." And these charts scream of that truth. We're not guessing here. These are the facts. These are the stats. You can verify the enrollment numbers and IQ correlations yourself. Okay, now let's break out some of these degrees that are at the bottom of the IQ barrel. The first one of these questionable degrees with the lowest IQ thresholds is education. Education. This is where the lowest performing students end up. And I mean academically and cognitively. Why? Because it's easy. It's not rocket science, nor does it require a surplus in intelligence. These students go on to become teachers, the people shaping your children's minds. They're not trained in classical knowledge or critical thinking, but in ideological garbage, DEI, anti-racism, critical race theory, equity-based grading. These are probably people who barely passed football physics and now want to teach your kids. In my opinion, this is not the ideal standard we want for educators. These are ideological missionaries, and over 75% of them, women. How about public administration and social services? It's basically a crash course in activist politics. These majors push the theories of structural oppression and systematic injustice. And then they send their grads into bureaucracies that manage our cities, our programs, and social services. 82% female. How about communication and journalism majors? These are your truth tellers, or so they'd have you believe. But clearly, they're not trained to report facts, or at least that's not what we see today when they get out. They appear to be trained in advocacy journalism where the narrative trumps the truth. And yep, about 2/3 are women. How about visual and performing arts? It's about performance arts soaked in activism. These students become filmmakers, media creators, and cultural influencers. Again, mostly women. You think it's coincidence that feminist, Marxist, and progressive narratives have taken root in TV and media and movies? Traditional family roles are subverted or mocked, especially husbands and fathers who are often portrayed as dumb, clueless, or morally inferior to their female counterparts. Have you noticed that the male characters now often seem to be portrayed as toxic, incompetent, or unnecessary? That females are portrayed as strong leads or super cops, clearly depicted as superior both in combat and emotional intelligence, even unrealistically? I think the climax of this progressive woke culture nonsense has got to be Snow White. Once upon a time, Snow White was a story about innocence, courage, and love. Now, it's a lecture on intersectional feminism wrapped up in this Marxist utopia. Look, this might seem somewhat benign to a lot of people, but I would argue that it is extremely concerning for all Americans that these are the degrees that shape modern culture and institutions. Between our teachers, our government bureaucrats of social services, our journalists, our reporters, our artists, our media, we are getting bombarded by the most ridiculous and ignorant activism. And our younger, dumber, impressionable kids, they're just soaking it in. These graduates were not taught how to think. They were taught what to think. They weren't taught analysis. They were taught outrage. And now they produce slogans, not solutions. And most troubling of all, they've hijacked the term educated to imply intellectual superiority. Let me be clear. On the average, there's nothing intellectually superior about this group. Our higher educational system is broken. It has formalized acceleration of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Look at the G factors. Challenge my logic. This isn't intelligence. This is the illusion of comprehension built on credentialism and ideology. Now, real quick, let me debunk another lie that gets thrown in my face every once in a while. That scientists are overwhelmingly liberal. This bullshit statement, again, is more propaganda, and it's based on this 2009 Pew Research survey that made headlines by claiming that scientists overwhelmingly lean liberal. Hold the phone. Here's the thing they don't tell you. The term scientist in that particular survey is incredibly broad. Sure, it includes some hard scientists, real scientists, but it also lumps in a bunch of social scientists, political scientists, psychologists, and even media study experts. And what do all these liberal arts social science PhDs have in common? They don't require the same level of quantitative rigor, mathematical aptitude, or technical problem solving as STEM fields do. No one needs to know differential equations. You can get a PhD in gender studies and still be called a scientist under Pew's definition. Ironically, there are no science requirements except for rare cases in gender studies. These PhD programs are grounded in critical theory, feminist philosophy, postmodernism, intersectionality, queer theory, and cultural studies, not empirical science. What about the math requirements for PhDs in gender studies? Well, it turns out that even basic statistics may be optional for students doing some form of qualitative or quantitative research. Math proficiency is not required. All you need is a little bit more of that crystallized intelligence, as gender studies are far more rooted in theoretical reading and writing. So no, real science isn't inherently progressive. Social science is. And along those lines, I want to explain something that's going to be important and relevant later on in this series. And that is the progressive and liberal tendency to hijack certain words. And in this case, the word is scientist. We've hit this weird cultural movement where the word scientist no longer means someone who actually tests reality. It just means someone who confirms your ideology with fancy words. They're using the word scientist without actually doing any science. Let's get something straight. A scientist is not someone who feels strongly about a cause. A scientist is someone who follows the scientific method no matter where it leads. They are seekers of truth, of reality, and the process they use is called the scientific method. It consists of making an observation, then formulating a hypothesis, then making a prediction. Then you experiment and you test that prediction. And then you come up with your own analysis and conclusions. And if you're in academia, there's a replication and peer review process. Look, I'm Gen X, but I know when I went to high school, we had to do a primitive version of this. Now, I'm not sure if they still teach it today, but this application of the scientific method taught us humility, rigor, honesty, skepticism, and that's why we respected scientists. There was a time when they had the courage to be the ones that were willing to be wrong in public. But today, let me give you some real-world examples of what passes for science. A Columbia PhD in media studies analyzing Instagram posts through the lens of hegemonic whiteness calls herself an information scientist. A Harvard environmental justice scholar blending race, gender, and anti-capitalist theory into climate policy papers is introduced on NPR as an environmental scientist. A bioethicist from Harvard Medical School arguing pediatric policy based on cisnormative harm uses qualitative interviews and calls himself a medical scientist. These aren't people testing hypotheses. They aren't running experiments. They're not even pretending to be falsifiable. Real scientists test assumptions. Progressive scientists protect ideology. A real scientist uses logic and ensures reproducibility. A progressive scientist, on the other hand, uses lived experience, identity, and emotion. It's a difference between publishing falsifiable results and publishing unquestionable narratives. Science is about willing to be wrong. If you're never willing to be wrong, If your conclusions are pre-written and your job is just to dress it up in academic jargon, then you're not a scientist. You're just a storyteller with tenure. And hey, storytelling's fine, but don't confuse it with the scientific method, especially when public policy, medicine, education, and our liberty hang in the balance. And oh, by the way, to little Miss Nancy Hopkins, I would argue that anyone who doesn't want to know the truth, who doesn't want to search for reality, should not be calling themselves a scientist. So if you're wondering why the cultural institutions feel broken, why reason, logic, and truth seem under siege, look no further than the source. And they came with pink hair, pronouns, and a degree in oppression studies. So, while the liberal arts departments are busy grading based on equity, the STEM students, people with higher IQs, critical free thinkers, they're solving real problems with real consequences because they deal in truth grounded in objective reality. The STEM students, the engineers, the coders, the mathematicians, the physicists, the classical economists, the most intelligent, their world doesn't run on feelings. It runs on formula, logic, and evidence. We have to live in the real world. Our work is tethered to objective reality. It's not about feelings. It's about results and consequences. It's the same mindset that says, let's fix it and help people instead of blaming it on oppression. And here's a little fun fact for you. You'll recall the stat from earlier that of all the postgraduate master's degree holders, only 16% of master's degrees were from actual STEM fields. The other 84% of postgraduate master's degrees were non-STEM or liberal arts. Well, if we look at doctoral degrees, PhDs, and research doctorates, it completely flips. STEM degrees dominate, comprised of 2/3 of doctorate degrees. 2/3. Of those STEM doctorate degrees, almost half of them are engineering and computer science. Of this group, only 35% lean liberal. And I don't know if it's coincidence, but my subdiscipline of mechanical engineering consistently attracts the highest concentration of right-leaning or politically conservative students in postgraduate education. I suspect this is because of the intellectual requirements to be able to see systems, architectures, and understand interconnections. Oh, and then there's the hard physical sciences, like physics, astronomy, and chemistry, math, so forth. Roughly only 40% lean liberal. And lastly, we have the life and biological sciences doctorates, which remember was the only area where women were in the majority. These programs feature the highest progressive presence within STEM, tracking at roughly 55% liberal. This includes superstars like our little Miss Nancy Hopkins, who almost fainted when she didn't like the data because it didn't align with her perception of the world. You have to develop solutions based on reality, based on human nature, based on the truth. When we fail to understand reality, when we choose to deny reality, we end up proposing or accepting propositions that are asinine and guaranteed to fail. Let me illustrate by giving you this one example that we should be able to deduce based on what we've learned in this chapter alone.
Anybody who could go down 300 to 3,000 feet in the mine, sure and hell can learn how to program as well. Give me a break. Anybody who can throw coal into a furnace can learn how to program, for God's sake.
Seriously, what a moron. The implications, the destruction that would have happened had we gone along with this asinine plan would have been disastrous. I would like to think that even without this chapter, common sense and your own experience would have told you that the IQ and intelligence needed to be a computer programmer is not equivalent to the intelligence needed to throw coal into a fire. The IQ requirement difference is huge. And I personally get frustrated when I hear these kind of asinine statements and then watch about half the country accepting or supporting this irrational approach. Using his own words, give me a break. Look, if you're a righteous, intelligent, compassionate, and kind person, you should want a society that benefits all, that maximizes individual liberty or pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, gender, religion, natural origin, or gender ideology. But that's not going to happen until we start building solutions that are based on reality, based on our human nature. Being empathetic, passionate, vocal is worse than wasteful if you're pointed in the wrong direction. Every evolved psychological trait has adaptive benefits, but every trait can be maladaptive when it overrides objective reality, consent, and individual rights. What do I mean by that? Well, let's revisit some of the female typical traits we discussed in the beginning of the chapter. Women tend to crush men when it comes to agreeableness. But when agreeableness becomes detached from economic reality and natural rights, it can create a preference for forced cooperation over voluntary cooperation, for coercion over consent. Their emotional reasoning leads them to think people should share because it's fair. The wealthy should be forced to help the poor. Outcomes should be equalized. This attitude, when combined with low IQ and high susceptibility, it leads to subscribing to Marxism, socialism, and redistribution. Harm avoidance is another typical female trait. But if your psychology prioritizes reducing harm above all else, then free speech becomes dangerous because speech can hurt people. This leads to hate speech laws, deplatforming, trigger warnings, paternalistic government, safetyism, and restrictions on offensive speech. The desire to protect people from harm is noble, but protecting people from offense often requires violating liberty and hiding reality from the masses. What about empathy? Empathy evolved to help us respond to the suffering of individuals standing in front of us. It did not evolve to optimize large-scale economic or political systems. Without the ability to reason, low IQ empathy leads to asinine immigration policy, criminal sentencing, and destructive welfare policies. Our high empathy systems respond emotionally to anecdotes, but are often blind to statistical consequences. And instead of implementing local retributive justice, it can lead to emotional justice. Women also score higher in social monitoring, emotional signaling, interpersonal awareness, what psychologists call social sensitivity. This includes recognizing facial expressions, interpreting emotional cues, reading social dynamics, and understanding interpersonal relationships. But this social sensitivity can lead to conformity and ideological enforcement, because when maintaining social harmony becomes the highest value, dissent becomes threatening. This leads to cancellation, social shaming, ideological purity tests, and blind groupthink. And as we discussed in previous chapters, truth requires disagreement. Liberty requires tolerating disagreement. In my humble opinion, this last distinction is a biggie. It's based on the studies where researchers have repeatedly found that men tend to be interested in things and women tend to be interested in people. Not always, not universally, but overwhelmingly on the average. And this isn't a small difference. To put it in perspective, the average woman scores higher in people-oriented interests than about 85% of men. Likewise, the average man scores higher in things-oriented interests than about 85% of women. This single difference explains a tremendous amount of what we observe in the real world. Independent of IQ, women disproportionately enter education, nursing, psychology, counseling, social work, and communications because women tend to employ people-oriented thinking, which emphasizes relationships, feelings, narratives, and lived experience. Men disproportionately enter engineering, physics, computer science, construction, mathematics, economics, and mechanics, because men tend to be more systems-oriented thinking, which emphasizes incentives, mechanisms, trade-offs, and objective constraints. Now, on the surface, society would like us to believe that being people-oriented is equal in value to being systems-oriented. What's wrong with that, right? In my opinion, a lot. These two perspectives are not equal. One is based on feelings, ignore human nature, and drives asinine and destructive solutions. The other is based on reality, in line with human nature, which leads to more rational and logical solutions. The people orientation perspective leads to social constructionism, which is dangerous nonsense. Those who lean towards social constructionism talk about fairness, but fail to understand what that means, or acknowledge the importance of incentives. They prefer stories over real statistics. They focus on intentions rather than understanding outcomes. They prioritize lived experience over objective measurements. They seek compassionate solutions without understanding the unintended consequences and the trade-offs of the proposed solutions. And our modern universities increasingly push people-oriented moral reasonings while suppressing systems-oriented reasoning. They put the feminine values, so to speak, on a pedestal above reason, logic, and systems thinking. I say so to speak because, again, not all women are like this and not all men are system thinkers. The problem occurs when empathy overrides consent, when compassion overrides liberty, when safety overrides free speech, and when social harmony overrides truth. Again, every virtue becomes dangerous when it is disconnected from reality and constrained by neither logic nor natural rights. I don't know how else to frame it other than directly. If your compassion leads you towards socialism, Marxism, you're a fool, and your quest is immoral. With the exception of a few elitists, it makes everyone poorer, destroys natural rights, and is implemented using coercion and force. If your harm avoidance propensities lead you to censorship, your social sensitivity leads you to conformity, if your empathy leads to emotional policymaking, then you're part of the problem with society. You are hurting the very people you claim you want to help. These ideas are unintelligent, immoral, and irrational. Good intentions plus a flawed moral compass produce coercive and destructive outcomes, plain and simple. So next time some whack job liberal Marxist comes up to you and says something like this,
I actually find it hysterical how a lot of Republicans and Trump supporters like to say that colleges and universities brainwash their students to be liberal, when it's like, have they ever just stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, that people that graduate college and are educated with a degree are more likely to lean liberal because they're smarter? Just a thought.
I can confidently say without question, no, it's not because you're smarter. You are delusional and you're living in la la land. You lack the mental clarity and aptitude to understand the bigger picture. And you're not only doing a disservice to yourself, you're doing a disservice to all society. Your ideas are hurting people and their quality of life. Okay, So in conclusion, what can we do about it? The justification for one of the options is written right into our Declaration of Independence. It states that governments are instituted to secure the individual rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government. Translation, that means rebellion, a civil war. It means violence, death. This immoral, liberal stupidity is crushing us, but I'm not sure I believe we are ready for this extreme measure, and I would like to think we all want to avoid this. So, option B, we educate our women, our youth, our citizens, and appeal to the masses. We appeal to the very same empathy that has indoctrinated our simple and susceptible people. We appeal to the parents who care about their daughters, their sons, as this applies to all young adults who fall victim to the injustices of our government. And the solution is simple. We need to get the government the hell out of funding higher education and enforce higher education institutional accountability. Hear me out. Millions of hopeful young Americans, our sons, our daughters, our nieces, our nephews, arrive in college believing they're investing in their future. Instead, too many are unknowingly signing up for the largest financial contract of their lives. They're 18 years old. They've never bought a house, never negotiated a salary, never run a business. Most have never even filed for taxes. Yet we tell them they're qualified to borrow $100,000 or more for an education whose financial return they have almost no ability to evaluate. And we call that informed consent? I don't. Think about when you were 18. Would you have understood amortization schedules, lifetime earning projections, opportunity costs, compound interest, labor market demand? Most adults don't even understand those concepts today, yet we expect these teenagers to stake their financial future on them? Then we surround them with clueless numbnuts with credentials, teachers, counselors, university recruiters, politicians, all repeating the same reassuring message. Just go to college. Follow your passion. If you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Just get the college degree. Everything else will work out. Well, for millions of people, it didn't. That kind of advice has financially crippled an entire generation, and it has disproportionately screwed women. There is no shortage of feel-good, moronic advice out there. Now, to be fair, some borrowed enormous sums of money out there that led to strong careers. If you borrowed $140,000 to become an electrical engineer making six figures, that loan may actually make some economic sense. If you borrow the same amount to become a nurse, probably still a good investment. Computer science, accounting, many skilled trades, medicine, those degrees frequently generate earnings that can justify their cost. But others entered programs where the number of graduates far exceed the number of available jobs, or where typical earnings were modest relative to the debt they incurred. Those were probably poor decisions on their part. But then we have the asinine who pursued highly specialized, and in my opinion silly, academic fields, including some programs centered on identity politics, activist theory, or topics such as gender studies, critical race theory, or courses focused on concepts like whiteness, often without anyone honestly discussing what the employment prospects or the expected return on investment looking forward look like. And though these grievance studies and oppression subjects may have been garbage and could have been understood simply by reading a book or watching a YouTube video, whether the subjects have intellectual value isn't the central question. We should be asking ourselves, was it right or fair to encourage young adults to incur life-changing debt without ensuring they understood the financial risks? Because freedom to choose, as we've discussed in previous chapters, without informed consent isn't real freedom. Moral rights begin with individual liberty, but moral liberty also requires honesty. Fraud, deception, material omissions, these undermine meaningful consent. It is a form of coercion, and it is immoral, in my opinion. If a financial advisor knowingly sold risky investments without explaining the risks, we'd call that unethical. If a car dealer hid known defects, we'd call that consumer fraud. So why is it acceptable when institutions market expensive degrees without warning about the likely earnings, the debt burdens, and the repayment outcomes? The tragedy isn't that these young people lacked ambition, it's that they trusted us. They trusted the parents, teachers, university, government, the very institutions society told them were acting in their best interests. Imagine graduating at 22 years old. Now you owe $140,000. You owe more money than your parents borrowed for the first home. Your monthly loan payment rivals a mortgage. You have to postpone buying a house, delay getting married, putting off having kids, not because you're irresponsible, but because your first major financial decision chained you to decades of repayment before your adult life truly began. Suppose instead of borrowing $140,000 at the age 18, that money had simply been invested. If you just dumped it into the stock market, like the S&P, which averages about 10% annually over the last 30 years, you'd have a little bit more than $2.4 million before you turn 48. If you dumped it into the NASDAQ, which averaged 12.9%, you would have over $5.3 million after 30 years. In other words, the real cost isn't merely the interest you paid. It's the wealth you never built. It's a retirement account that never existed. It's the first home you never purchased. It's the business you never started. It's decades of compound growth destroyed before your career even began. Compound interest is either the greatest force working for you or the greatest force working against you. This isn't merely an economic problem, it's a moral one. Every dollar spent servicing unnecessary debt is a dollar that never builds a family, never starts a business, never creates a retirement account, never compounds into future prosperity. The opportunity cost isn't just measured in dollars. It's measured in delayed dreams, lost independence, and years of unnecessary anxiety. And who benefited? Certainly not the students, definitely not the taxpayer, and sure as hell not society, who now has to battle the ignorance of indoctrinated citizens. It was the universities who received their tuition. If these degrees are such incredible investments, why don't the universities finance them themselves? Seriously, Harvard, Berkeley, University of Michigan, all you woke state universities and Ivy League schools, why don't you loan the money? You believe in your product, don't you? If your graduates are going to become wildly successful, you should be thrilled to finance them. You'll make a fortune. Funny how quickly confidence disappears when someone else's money isn't involved. This is the fallacy of socialism, of Keynesian economics, of empathy-driven government subsidies. We need to stop subsidizing universities and colleges. We need to get the government out of the business of issuing student loans for joke degrees. If we force universities to provide the student loans, not the taxpayer, suddenly the admissions office will start asking questions. What's the median income after 5 years of graduation? What's the percentage of graduates who actually work in this field? How many repay their loans? What's expected lifetime earnings premium? Notice something? Those are exactly the same questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Austrian economics has been explaining this for generations. People respond to incentives. Incentives shape behavior. Look, the universities aren't evil per se. They're responding rationally in their own self-interest, not yours. Government guaranteed the money, so university raised the prices. Government guaranteed repayment, so the universities expanded programs to include bullshit social science degrees. Government removed financial accountability, so universities stopped worrying about economic outcomes. That's not capitalism. That's moral hazard created by government socialist policies. Real capitalism requires risk. Real markets require consequences. Real investment requires accountability. Natural rights give you every freedom to study philosophy, gender studies, art history, ancient Mesopotamian poetry, basket weaving, or finger painting for trans people. Study whatever fascinates you. That's liberty. But natural rights does not obligate your neighbor to finance your educational choices. There's a profound moral difference between having the freedom to buy something and having the right to make someone else pay for it. If universities truly believe in the value of what they're selling, they should become the partners, not the spectators. They should loan the money, share the risk. They win when the student wins. They lose when the student loses. That's the power of accountability. And accountability is needed to turn education back to an investment instead of a government-financed lottery ticket with a diploma attached. No institution should profit from encouraging young adults into overwhelming debt while bearing almost none of the financial consequences if that education fails to provide an adequate return. That's not compassion. That's not fairness. If we truly care about the next generation, not just in virtue signaling and speeches, but in practice, then we should stop measuring the success of higher education by how many students enroll. We should measure it by how many young Americans leave campus with knowledge, skills, opportunity, and the financial freedom to build meaningful, independent lives. Because the purpose of education was never supposed to be about creating delusional kids with lifelong debt. It was supposed to be about creating capable, free, and flourishing human beings. Our American children deserve nothing less. Now, before I leave, I want to let you know, I did not realize I've been tripping the algorithm censors from the get-go. I don't do this for a living. I'm not sponsored, as you probably realize. If you want to help spread this message, don't just hit like and subscribe. Go back and hit like and subscribe on all the videos. Share the videos. Hype the videos. I welcome intelligent feedback and discourse. But remember, this series is cumulative, and you can't just jump in and start challenging my presumptions. If you want to challenge my general moral compass, go back to Chapter 1 and let me know where there's a disconnect, a break from the logic. I'm also a realist. I know if these videos gain any traction, I may get a lot of name-calling. But, as I stated in the last chapter, name-calling is a telltale sign of American fools who are subject to the Dunning-Kruger effect. I will be sure to give those type of comments their due attention. So on that happy note, peace out from Virginia.